De Burgos partió ese rey para Salamanca. Welcome, friends. It's nice to see all of you this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the program in Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar with Professor Rebecca Wartell entitled Better Widowed Than Married, Conversa Women in Early Modern Europe. This webinar is part of our Peak to Peak series, and this is a project that creates conversations between CU Boulder faculty on the one hand and audiences and communities across Colorado and beyond on the other. This program is supported by CU's Office for Outreach and Engagement, and it's a partnership not just with that office, but also with communities and civic organizations across Colorado. And I want to take this opportunity first, before we begin, to thank those communities. The Corazon de Trinidad Creative District, the Garfield Public Library District, the Trinidad Carnegie Public Library, Western Colorado University, the Aspen Jewish Congregation, the Boulder JCC, Kavod on the Road, and Temple Aaron in Trinidad. We're deeply grateful for your partnership. So in a moment, I'm going to say something more about tonight's speaker. First, though, I just want to offer a few words about the music you just heard and about the program itself. So beginning with that music, that piece, and I apologize in advance for how I'm going to sort of butcher the title, that piece was La Muerte de Príncipe Don Juan, the death of Prince Don Juan. It was recorded by Alicia Ben Dayan in Ashkelon in Israel in 1979. I believe we might hear more about that piece of music a little later in tonight's conversation. Okay, so that was the music. Now a word about the program itself. This webinar is very much a space for conversation, and that conversation will take three forms. And those of you who've participated in one of these programs, by now you know the routine. So first, after tonight's speaker, Professor Wartell presents for about 25 minutes. She and I will be in conversation with one another for another 15 or so minutes. Second, after that, we want to open things up for a conversation, not just between me and Professor Wartell, but between all of you and Professor Wartell. And you can do that via the Q&A function on your screen. Should be showing up somewhere towards the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, you can write in a question. That question will be visible to me. I'll share it with Professor Wartell and the group, and she will respond. And you don't need to wait to the end of the program. You can start adding those questions as they occur to you during the presentation. And so finally, we want this to be an opportunity, not just for a conversation between me and Professor Wartell, and not even just for a conversation between you and Professor Wartell, but also for conversations between you and all of your fellow participants. So if you click on that chat function, you can also write a comment to the group as a whole. Many of you are doing this already. Just make sure that you're addressing it to all panelists and attendees. During the program itself, your comments will be visible only to me and Professor Wartell, but right now, if you click on the chat function and set it to address that broad group, your comment will be visible to everyone. And so as I introduce our speaker, I really want to encourage all of you to write a greeting to the group, to say who you are, where you're from, and why you decided to participate tonight. We are a community of learning, and community is built through these kinds of connections. And we'll open up the chat function again at the end. Okay, so none of you is here for me, so let me now introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Rebecca Wartell is a member of the Jewish Studies faculty here at CU Boulder, where she researches Sephardic Jews in the early modern period. She focuses on issues relating to refugees and migration after the Spanish expulsion, with a particular interest in the economic and social dynamics between established Jewish communities, religious authorities, and exiles. She's written extensively on these topics. Her most recent publication appeared in the Mediterranean Historical Review. It's entitled Rabbis and Refugees, Theological Responses to the Treatment of Converso Migrants in 16th Century Candia. And before joining us here at CU Boulder, Professor Wartell received a degree in theological studies from Harvard and a PhD in history from Monash University. She also, I would add, is a fourth generation, I think I got that right, native Coloradan. Please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Professor Rebecca Wartell.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Professor Sachs, and to all of you who I can see saying hello in the chat box. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that in future years we can all be together in person. But as we were actually saying, there's some benefits to Zoom, which is that people from a much broader regional area can join us. So I'm very happy to see all of you here, and thank you so much for joining me. So the way today will work is I'm going to share some slides and talk for about the next 20-25 minutes. And then I will look forward to a broader conversation with Professor Sachs and all of you as well. So let's get started. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay. So the music that you just heard, as Professor Sachs mentioned, will be explained more in the talk, but hopefully you were at least able to enjoy a clip of that Ladino ballad selection. The origins of the Ladino saying, antes viuda que casada, translated as she was widowed before she was married, are found in the Sephardic oral traditions that recount the untimely and tragic death of Prince Don Juan of Asturias in October 1497. As the only adult son of the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Aragon and Castile, Don Juan married Princess Margaret of Austria, just 6 months earlier, before he died in Salamanca at the young age of 19. Different records report the cause of his death as smallpox, possibly tuberculosis, or most broadly as sexual overexertion in his passionate newlywed trysts with Princess Margarita. 2 years his junior, Margarita became a widow at just 17. And although she was pregnant at the time of the prince's death, the saga added new layers when the infant, heir apparent, was stillborn 6 months later. The death of Don Juan captivated the Iberian imagination, becoming the subject of countless laments at the end of the 15th century. People are always fascinated by royal drama. And even in more recent decades, in our own time, the story's been featured in movies and Spanish telenovelas on the subject. The music you heard tonight as you entered this webinar was an example of this genre. It's a Ladino ballad entitled La Muerte del Príncipe Don Juan. It not only tells the heartrending tale of the prince's death, but I will argue tonight, reflects two important aspects of the Sephardic Jewish experience that will be our focus. First, we learn that Spanish and Portuguese Jews participated in a national process of grieving for the deceased prince 5 years after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. Remember, he died in 1497. The ballad shows that there was a continuing association with the Spanish royalty and the drama of the empire, despite Jews having been cast out of Spain by Don Juan's own parents 5 years before. The Ladino ballad was sung by both Jewish exiles in the growing Sephardic diaspora and also by Converso Jews living in Spain and Portugal as Cristianos Nuevos, new Christians. The popularity of the ballad serves as a link between conversos in the Iberian Peninsula and Sephardim who left to openly practice Judaism in exile, most often in North Africa or in the Ottoman regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. Still identified as Spanish or Portuguese, still speaking and singing in Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, this was their national narrative. The second insight I want to emphasize from La Muerte del Príncipe Don Juan is the lyrical line that I highlight on this screen in green. Antes viuda que casada. This is the notion that the princess was widowed before she was married. This is a cynical phrase that speaks to the common incidence of young women as widows in the late medieval and early modern period. Countless ordinary women, not princesses, in Spain, both Jews, Muslims, and Catholics, and more broadly throughout the early modern Mediterranean, experienced widowhood, often as a result of tragic circumstance. The experience of Princess Margarita was shared by other young, sometimes childless women facing a world of uncertainty upon the deaths of their husbands. Here, they could join in chorus to sing a lament of her death in empathy and grief. Many factors contribute to the epidemic of widowhood at that time, including war, plague, maritime travel, and piracy, which ultimately led to the staggering statistic that widows comprised between 25 and 30% of the adult population of Western Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. This is a really big percentage of the population. If you think of the adult population, 50% women, that half of women lived as widows. While some husbands' deaths were confirmed, countless others were simply counted as missing, husbands who never returned from travel to the New World, or perhaps chose to live in another region with a concubine or a second wife and family. For Jewish women specifically, many were in arranged marriages with men who were significantly older. As a cultural norm and a familial strategy for financial stability, intergenerational marriage was very common in Sephardic communities, where girls as young as 12 could be married to older Jewish men who inevitably passed decades before their spouse. After the anti-Jewish pogroms in the northern kingdoms of Castile and Aragon beginning in 1391, when tens of thousands of Jews were forcibly baptized and many others were killed, the number of Jewish widows in Spain rose significantly. So by the year 1497, which marked the death of Prince Don Juan, and also the year that the Jews who had left Spain for refuge in Portugal were also forced to convert, flee, or be burnt at the stake. This year marks the height of the Jewish refugee crisis at the end of the 15th century. The trauma behind the phrase antes viuda que casada then resonated with numbers of Jewish women widowed before they had hardly set foot into marriage. In addition to the clues we find in Sephardic oral ballad traditions, the experiences of Conversa women can be glimpsed in rabbinic responsa that were produced after the dispersion of Spanish Jewry. This is where my own research really sits. Most of my research looks at halachic rules or verdicts related to family law, especially matters of betrothal, divorce, widowhood, and levirate marriage, which tell us about the lives of ordinary Jewish women in the aftermath of the expulsion. A large portion of the responsa, written and transmitted through the centuries by disciples of leading rabbis, are concerned with the theoretical and also the practical aspects of religious legitimacy related to conversos. The responsa are literally questions and answers, she'elot utshuvot, which are posed to the rabbinic authorities about what's kosher or halachic, what's the right thing to do in an unprecedented circumstance. So the responsa from this time period ask questions like the following. Is a converso a valid witness in a Jewish court? Does a divorce between two conversos require a get, the Jewish divorce decree? Is a conversa widow bound by the Jewish laws of levirate marriage? Are third and fourth generation conversos still considered Jews? Since there are essentially no available texts written and produced by women in the early modern period, responsa, these legal Jewish decisions, are an important and often underutilized source of information to learn about women's lives. So I'm going to present a few of these responsa texts here. First, I'm going to mention also, and this image may look familiar, this is a woodcut that was on the publicity for this talk, presenting the image of the chalitza ceremony. Here you can see they're wearing typical Ottoman dress. And for women who were like Princess Margarita, widowed before having children, for Jewish women specifically, if they were widowed before having children, there was an additional problem that they faced, which was the Jewish institution of yibum. This is a biblical practice of levirate marriage. In such cases, the brother-in-law of a childless widow was expected to marry the widow in order to procreate and carry on the lineage of his deceased brother, her deceased husband. The marriage could only be circumvented through the ritual called chalitza, described in Deuteronomy 25, verses 7 through 10, where the unwilling brother-in-law would be relieved of his duties if the widow would do the following. She shall, quote, go up to him in the presence of elders, pull the sandal off of his foot, spit in his face, and make this declaration. Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house, and he shall go in Israel by the name of the family of the unsandaled one, Beit Chalutz Hana'al. So what happened to Sephardic women who were widowed during this time period? It's useful to note that most rabbinic authorities since the time of Maimonides, 12th century Spain, generally took the position that the enforcement of levirate marriage should be averted. Instead, widows should be emancipated and free to remarry a person of their own choice. Women widowed by acts of war or natural disaster, referred to as makat medina, did not usually have to go through the ceremonial release of chalitza by her husband's brother, as it was established that the husband died of causes beyond anyone's control. The woman, often referred to as a chained widow or an agunot, was also exempt from chalitza when it could be only presumed that the husband was dead. This is sometimes called a grass widow, the situation where a husband's MIA, he's missing in action, nobody actually knows where he is, and a sufficient amount of time has passed that the widow is ready to move on. It was widely accepted by Sephardic rabbis that the grief of the agunot was painful enough without also having to go through the public humiliation of the chalitza ceremony. As the Rambam, this is Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides, as he notes, the principal aim of rabbinic rulings in agunah matters is to be lenient for the sake of the agunah wife. The freeing of an agunah was a great mitzvah, according to Maimonides, akin to saving a life, according to the rabbis who generally advised benevolence toward the widow. We have specific examples from the late 15th and early 16th century coming from North Africa, Italy, Egypt, Ottoman Salonika, which is Thessaloniki today, Constantinople, and Tzfat, all Sephardic Ottoman rabbis that also promote leniency toward the agunah, noting that to keep a widow chained to her brother-in-law or to a combative husband refusing her divorce might lead her to might cause her to commit adultery, leading to the birth of illegitimate children, which was considered an even worse shame upon the woman and her whole community. Rabbis frowned upon the possibility that an agunah, a chained woman, would have to live in poverty or stay in a physically or emotionally abusive relationship without the prospect of happiness in the future. 16th century chief rabbi of Salonika, Rabbi Shmuel de Medina, sorry, I'm gonna move to the next slide so that you can see that quote. Shmuel de Medina, who was usually conservative on family matters, noted on this topic of agunot that every halachic authority should look at every aspect to seek permissive rulings for agunot and should not search for unnecessary reasons to be stringent. This should be a goal of all of those who occupy themselves with Torah, even when a husband was simply missing or the marriage had become dysfunctional due to issues including impotence, imprisonment, mental illness, or deceit. The relationship could be deemed kiddushei ta'ut, a mistaken marriage from which the wife could be released without being subject to levirate laws. Another category of a mistaken marriage here is apostasy, when women became chained because their husbands converted to another religion, either by choice or more often in our time period of the 15th, 16th century, more often by compulsion or force, levirate marriage was also exempt. This is especially relevant here, considering the conversos of the Spanish Inquisition. Some cases after the Spanish expulsion have both the husband and wife seeking a return to Judaism after their forced conversion by migrating either to North Africa or to Ottoman Islamic areas. One interesting case was presented to Rabbi Shimon ben Tzemach Duran, also referred to as the Ribash, who was born in Valencia and fled Spain for Algiers, today Algeria, after the riots of 1391. In this case, a Conversa woman came from Majorca to the North African town of Bougie with her young son. She was asked of her religious status and informed the rabbi that she had married a Converso man from Aragon in a Catholic ceremony, and they had lived together for 3 months and conceived this child. Then her husband went overseas and never returned, although they had planned to move to North Africa in order to return to Judaism. She approached the rabbinic court in Algiers and wanted to know if she could marry again, this time as a Jewish woman. The Ribash, Rabbi Tzemach ben Duran, ruled that since she wasn't married initially according to Jewish law, her first marriage was not valid and therefore she could remarry in the Jewish tradition. Giving conversos the benefit of the doubt in these early years after forced baptism allowed also conversos to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court, as long as they had retained a crypto-Jewish or secret Jewish practice and identity while still in Spain, but not if they had eaten non-kosher food or consciously stayed in Spain longer than they had to before returning to Judaism. Following the advice of Maimonides centuries earlier, the rabbis stated it was preferable to move to an Islamic region where Jews could live openly as protected minorities rather than within the realm of the Catholic Inquisition. As more time passed, the complexities of Sephardic Jewish family law increased. Many conversos did not leave Iberia in a timely manner or return to Judaism as directed by the rabbis. Business and family connections often kept them tied to their homeland, where they lived as new Christians, retaining crypto-Jewish practices in the home. Many of these Spanish and Portuguese converso families were exclusively endogamous with each other, meaning that they only married among other converso families, ostensibly to maintain their hidden Jewish roots. One responsa on this topic comes from Rabbi Yosef ben David ibn Lev, also known by his acronym Maharival. He was also of Ottoman Salonika and later Constantinople, or Istanbul, who addressed the validity of converso marriages, who had public Catholic wedding ceremonies in a number of converso communities in Amsterdam, Venice, and Ancona, Italy. Often these visible displays of Christian matrimony were a converso family's explicit effort to assert their Catholicism in the most public visible way. This was often followed by a hushed private chuppah, or a Jewish wedding ceremony, in their homes. Rabbi Ibn Lev assured the conversos that these Christian rite marriages did not exclude them from returning to Judaism once they had migrated into the Ottoman Empire. Ibn Lev wrote, as you can see on the slide here, that every Jewish woman from Portugal or Castile should not have to worry about their betrothal, as they are still Jews after the Inquisition, and don't divide those who were forced to convert and those that came after because they were delayed in returning to Judaism. They all knew that their mothers were Jews and they are all of the same nation. And from birth and from their mother's womb, they knew they were Jews. They saw their community members returning to Judaism under the wings of the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, which he implies is only in the Ottoman Empire. He emphasizes the matrilineal tradition within rabbinic Judaism to justify the Jewish status of female conversas. He assures these women that their marriage, which initially took place outside of a traditional Jewish context, could still be considered Jews, and that they could fulfill their their return to Judaism by becoming Ottoman subjects. I'll quickly mention one more responsa before I move on. Rabbi Yosef Detrani, known also by Maharit, was another Sephardic rabbi who made comments about the validity of conversos and their identity in the inability to verify matrilineal descent in later generations of converso families. Over a century after expulsion from Iberia, Moshe Detrani described the conversos' general lack of knowledge of Jewish law and custom, which in turn led many men to marry non-Jewish women. He went on to claim that those men who did marry Jewish women did so only because they were afraid that their secret Jewish background would otherwise be revealed, but not because of any personal religious conviction against intermarriage. Detrani ruled in an example of levirate marriage, for instance, where one brother was in Ottoman Greece and the other brother lived as a converso in Portugal, that he was therefore unable to perform the chalitza ceremony, the release of the widow, because he was living in, quote, the land of persecution, and his religious practices were impossible to determine from afar. These responsa give us glimpses of converso family life and the Jewish communal position in the early modern Mediterranean. There's many, many more examples of responsa that I've looked at and translated that I haven't included here given our limited time. What I do want to highlight, though, is that all of these responsa are recorded through a lens of patriarchy. They're written by men, for men, but about women. We have to ask, where are the women's voices? What do we really know about women's experiences? We know that while converso men were often keeping up appearances in society, adopting new Christian names and attending public Catholic Mass, converso women were typically the keepers of crypto-Jewish identity in the home, lighting Shabbat candles, baking challah and making other kosher recipes, taking daughters to natural flowing waters for mikvah, and observing Pesach rituals, Passover rituals. For many women, the dream of returning to Judaism involved moving to new unfamiliar lands, and therefore remained just dreams as real life took over. There's so many stories of traveling converso men lost at sea, drowned, killed, or pirated and sold into slavery on their journeys, leaving behind grieving families and leaving widows with the task of continuing to operate businesses and manage their assets and properties. So I'm going to talk for a minute about a few exceptional and maybe more popular cases, since from the responsa we can extract information about more ordinary women. There's a few very famous women who we would be remiss not to mention. The most famous conversa woman being that of Doña Gracia Mendez, pictured here as a Renaissance Italian woman from the 16th century. Widows who had been released from levirate marriage could independently inherit money and other assets, including land and rental contracts. They had unparalleled agency in their financial and romantic affairs. As autonomous women who managed their own finances, women could lend money, sell, lease, mortgage, give away their properties to whoever they wished. Because they had greater control over their assets, these Jewish widows enjoyed a freedom of action unknown to their Christian counterparts in Spain. And these women were often thrust into commerce following the early deaths of their husbands. They could file their own lawsuits, represent themselves in court. Whereas most Jewish women were considered chattel or property, girls the property of their fathers before marriage, wives the property of their husbands, and agunot, the chained women to their brothers-in-law or their uncooperative estranged husbands. It was only widows who were essentially free from marital obligation. In late medieval Spain, there's evidence of widows serving as moneylenders, merchants of silk, silver, jewels, and even as practitioners of medicine. The details of most of these women's lives are not recorded in the texts, aside for a few examples of the most affluent and influential. This image of Doña Gracia Mendez, her story is quite well known. She became a widow with one daughter at the age of 25. Doña Gracia, who was initially a Portuguese Conversa, went on to be a spokeswoman and financier of the Sephardic Jewish community and also of Jewish communities forming in Ottoman Palestine. She lived, after leaving Portugal, she went to Ferrara, Italy, where she returned to Judaism, and then moved on further eastward into Turkey, where she was renowned for her influence as an advisor to the Sultan, and also as a political lobbyist for Portuguese Jewish refugees. Rabbi Moshe Detrani, the father of Yosef, who I mentioned in a responsa text earlier, referred to her in one of his responsa texts as the lady who is famous all over the empire, from his post in Ottoman Sfat. One biographer of Doña Gracia's life noted that, quote, widowhood offered exceptional benefits. It was a woman's sole springboard to autonomy. Although only 25 years old, any decision about a future husband or lover, any decision concerning the deployment of her immense fortune, any decision concerning the future of her late spouse Francisco's merchant banking enterprise was hers alone. I want to give one other example and to broaden our perspective in the last few minutes of my talk beyond the Sephardic world and into the larger early modern Jewish world. Some of you may have recognized this image or the story of Gluckel of Hamlin. She was also an early modern Jewish widow of the 17th century in Germany. And her memoirs, published in Yiddish, are the first example we have from that were written and published by a Jewish woman in the early modern period. It should be no surprise at this point that her status as a successful businesswoman and as a mother of 14 children should be no surprise that Gluckel was also a widow. Her memoirs, written originally for her children as a means of processing her grief and as a memoir of her extraordinary life, were also testament to the larger experience that Jewish widows who had some level of economic means could retain in early modern Europe. Gluckel was proud of her literacy. She was skilled in business negotiations and travel. And she managed to support and marry all of her children who lived into adulthood, which was 12. Two died in childhood. She wrote about her dignified widowhood in her life and those of her sister-in-law Yente, who she lauded for not wanting to remarry specifically because she was young, energetic, and had many goals to accomplish. Gluckel also resisted remarriage until she succumbed in her later years to the advances of her second husband named Hirsch Levy, who she noted was the wealthiest man in Ashkenaz. Levy wined and dined and charmed her until he shortly went bankrupt after their marriage, at which point Gluckel laments in her memoirs that Levy's gold chains turned into rope and iron shackles after she married him. So this was her ultimate lament and probably what she would say was her worst mistake, was remarrying. This was true for many widows in the early modern period because they knew that if they remarried, especially if they had a significant amount of assets, that they would then lose control of those assets to their second husbands. And so for that reason and others, many women were very resistant to lose the autonomy that they had gained in their status as a widow. Smart, motivated, and literate women like Doña Gracia and Gluckel are notable for their money. Their emancipated status allowed them to grow wealth and influence their communities. And although they're privileged and exceptional, these women measured their success having the resources to pay for their children's education and negotiate marriage dowries single-handedly. There's no doubt that had they not been widows, they would have remained in the shadows of their husbands, relegated to the role of domesticity rather than to create legacies as authors, entrepreneurs, and political activists in their own right. Reclaiming their destiny as widows, these early modern examples are a far cry from the helpless, childless saga of Princess Margarita, widow of Prince Don Juan. Read in this light, then, perhaps a more accurate translation of the Ladino phrase, antes viuda que casada, would be that it is better to be widowed than married, or widowhood above marriage, given what we know about Sephardic women of the early modern period. So that is where I'll stop. And I appreciate all of your attention, and I really look forward to our conversation as Professor Sachs comes back. There he is.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Wartell, for that presentation. Thank you also to those of you who have already put in some questions, either in the chat function or in the Q&A. I would encourage you all to continue to share those questions as they occur to you. I, though, have the profound privilege of being in control of the webinar license right now. So that means I get to ask the first few questions before I start sharing some questions from the group. So I thought I could kind of first ask a question about scholarship and then ask a question about power and status. And my first question, Professor Wartell, is how did you come to be interested in this topic? What led you to attend to these voices, these experiences, and why haven't these issues received as much attention as they should have received in the field of Jewish studies?
That is a very good question. Thank you for asking that. For my own personal experience, I think that I kind of came across all of this by mistake in some ways. I was doing my PhD research initially on, well, first I decided on the genre of rabbinic responsa because I do think that it's sort of an untapped resource of glimpses into everyday situations. But the more that I was looking and the more that I was spending countless hours trying to translate these texts, I realized how many of them were preoccupied, especially with the issue of levirate marriage and marital status more generally. And that's, partly because family law, even to this day, within the Jewish world is determined by rabbinic courts. Jews would practice their marriage and divorce and family laws according to the guidance of rabbis. And so, especially after the expulsion in 1492, there were so many unprecedented situations, given the fact that about half of Spain's Jews were converted to Catholicism. So many families shattered and so many questions that had really never been faced before, that it was kind of impossible to ignore just the sheer amount of responsa that related to these topics. And then I would just say also that I was really trying to find a way to glean women's experiences out of this genre of text that is, extremely male-oriented and dominated by rabbis, which were all men at that time.
Well, I actually want to follow up on precisely that question of power and status that you just raised, and ask a little. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit more about the awareness of and reactions to what you've described as this extraordinary and exceptional autonomy that some women enjoyed, that some widows enjoyed. Based on the kind of texts you've presented us, it seems like there was an awareness that this status of being widowed, especially being a Jewish widow, afforded unique opportunities. There was that line in the song, there was the resistance you mentioned of many widows to getting remarried. And I'm wondering whether there was any kind of backlash to this extraordinary autonomy that these exceptional widows enjoyed. Was there backlash within the Jewish community, attempt to curtail or respond to this autonomy? Was it at all perceived as a threat? And then was there any reaction from outside the Jewish community? You talked about the ways in which these widows often enjoyed a kind of autonomy and status that wasn't, for example, accessible to their non-Jewish counterparts. Was there any awareness of and reaction to this status outside the Jewish world?
Both good questions, and I'll try to answer them based on what I know. Certainly those women of the most exceptional wealth, and they were often, in fact, courted to come to particular cities, port cities, both in Ottoman and also in some Italian contexts, where, I guess you could think the motivation could have been that they would be bringing their extraordinary wealth with them, and therefore given sort of a place of influence and prominence in the society. Certain port cities, not specifically to women, but to Portuguese Jews, essentially meaning Converso Jews, were issued invitations, for example, in Venice and Ancona and some of those Eastern Adriatic Italian port cities that were really trying to compete with each other to establish trade connections with the Ottomans. And so it was especially Jews that played an intermediary role in those trade networks. So in some ways, I think that these women were given an unusual position. And I'm sure that for more ordinary women, those whose stories are harder to find or to hear, were often encouraged to remarry, to sort of go back into a more domestic traditional role within, Jewish societies, that it would be sort of unseemly for a woman to have this much power and agency. But once emancipated, and there was also this sort of aversion to levirate marriage during this time period, there was, no legal way of forcing women into a subsequent marriage.
Well, maybe following up on that, I'd love to turn to some of the questions that are being posed in the Q&A right now, because we're getting a lot of questions about these kinds of issues, about the financial realities and conditions in which these widows operated. So I want to begin with some questions from the audience about the widows whom you discussed, then turn a little bit to some questions about kind of the historical context here, and then think about some questions relating to the enduring legacy of the narratives and stories and voices you have presented. And so the first question that I want to ask is a question from the audience about the kind of material realities of many of these widows. Just how well did many of these widowed women do in terms of supporting themselves? What kind of financial success did they enjoy, and what kind of challenges did they encounter? And also, what do we know about the conditions of widows who are not so well off, of widows who found themselves in the Jewish community in more desperate or challenging financial circumstances?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that the initial intention of Yibum, this levirate marriage institution that we find, all the way back to Deuteronomy, biblical times, was really a measure of protection for widows who were, not all that uncommon. And so, the institution of a widow knowing that her brother-in-law would ostensibly take her in and care for her and make sure that she wasn't, living in absolute poverty, and also to provide for any children that she may have already had, was there and continued to be there in the early modern period, that there were significant charitable, I guess, organizations or funds designated for the support of widows specifically. And that would be especially true of women who didn't inherit, which was probably more often the case than these women who inherited extraordinary wealth from their husbands, either families or businesses that in many cases they were able to grow even further. So there was sort of communal institutions in place to support orphaned children and also widows. But we do see exceptions to that, especially when women were resistant to give up the freedom that they had, and the sense of being able to manage their own financial and also romantic affairs.
So picking up on precisely this question of the ability of widows to manage their own financial and romantic affairs, and the different kind of incentives and strategic factors shaping the choices being made in this context. We have a question here about not just the constraints, but the opportunities opened up by remarriage. We have a question here about how, on the one hand, remarriage surely results in the loss of autonomy for many widows. In this context, the loss of control over their finances. But the question is whether there were any other strategic incentives, for example, that might have led some widows to seek remarriage. Were there ways in which some widows saw remarriage as an opportunity to, let's say, kind of multiply their money, to take the resources that they had been able to accumulate and curate and create, and now multiply them through the kind of additional mobility that a new husband might have in that particular socioeconomic context?
I mean, I think if you asked Gluckel, right, Gluckel of Hamelin, where the gold chains transformed into shackles of poverty, she would say no, right? But I think that not only in terms of financial motivations, but something that comes through a lot in the responsa is on a more personal or even spiritual level, that remarrying would help a Conversa woman reintegrate into a Jewish community that viewed her with suspicion. Even if she had been part of forced public baptism and been, forced to convert to Catholicism, if she's returning into either North African or Ottoman areas where she could live openly as a Jewish woman, and in a few other exceptions in Europe, a few other exceptional places, she was often expected to remarry as part of her process of returning to Judaism. And so I think it would be sort of a way of displaying her legitimacy, her way of showing the community that she really was dedicated to returning to Judaism, that she had maintained, as I mentioned in the talk, crypto-Jewish practices, retention of her Jewish identity in certain ways, while she had to live as a Conversa, as a new Christian. And so it was sort of a concerted way of showing her sincerity in returning to those communities. And so a lot of times when rabbis are wrestling with these sort of issues, it's like, okay, how can we arrange for the chalitza? How can we arrange to have this Conversa woman released from the obligations of her brother-in-law? And in what other ways, the rabbis would debate whether she is still considered a legitimate Jewish woman or not. Some of the quotes that I showed you tended, at least in the early decades after of the Spanish Inquisition, by the middle of the 15th century until the expulsion of 1492, that these women should feel inspired to return to their Judaism. So I don't know as much if it was motivated by financial gain to remarry, but I think that it was definitely part of reclaiming an identity and rejoining the Sephardic diaspora that was growing and establishing itself in these other parts of the world.
So if we just talked about the potential appeal of, or at least incentives for remarrying, we also have a question about the potential appeal of and incentives for widowhood. Are you aware of any instances in which Jewish women killed their husbands for the autonomy provided by widowhood?
That is a good question. I don't know of any specific examples, but I do know that a woman who, I wish I had I can't remember the name of it right now. I wish I had my notes in front of me, but a woman who had already buried 2 husbands, who had already become a widow twice, who was looking to remarry thrice, had to go through a particular sort of vetting process to make sure that she wasn't a murderer, to make sure that she hadn't been responsible in one or both of her previous husband's deaths, in some sort of, sinister way of, taking their wealth. And, you hear stories like this. So there is that awareness, and there is some rabbinic debate. And I'm sorry that the name is just escaping me right now of what she's called within the rabbinic courts, but that's as close as I know of sort of women viewed with suspicion, and that would only take place after she had lost at least 2 other husbands.
So building on these questions, I now want to shift away from some of these questions from the audience, specifically focused on the experiences of the widows whom you discussed, and think a little bit more about some questions relating to the broader historical context that you are discussing. The first is a question from the audience about geographic diversity. Do you know anything about the differences between the experiences of Conversa widows who, for example, chose to seek refuge in Italy, as opposed to Conversa widows who may have chosen to seek refuge elsewhere?
It's a good question. As I mentioned from, in the talk, responsa come especially within the Sephardic rabbinic network from all over the Mediterranean. So we have examples coming from rabbinic courts in what today is, Morocco and Algiers. We have some cases that involve questions around the Italian cities that I mentioned before along the Adriatic port, especially Venice, also Ferrara, where there was a significant Portuguese Conversa community that was able to return to Judaism. And then, most especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. So places like Salonika, which became a very large center, both in terms of integrating Sephardic refugees, Iberian refugees post Spanish expulsion, but also already a significant sort of local or original Jewish community there that was not Sephardic, but was Greek-speaking Romaniot community. And so, there's and of course, really large cities like Izmir and Istanbul in Turkey. So there is some dispersion, and the rabbis shared these responsa decisions with each other. They would cross-reference each other, they would quote each other, they would debate, especially, around issues of who as a converso was, could claim Jewish identity and who couldn't, how many generations had to pass before they sort of lost the ability to claim Jewish identity, and without having to go through a full conversion. What do you do about men, for example, who weren't circumcised? What do you do about wine produced by conversos? Is it considered kosher? I mean, the list of issues addressed in these texts is really, really wide. In terms of widows specifically, I wouldn't say that there's like a trend in any particular way of, how things were in one community and weren't in another community, but each is like any sort of legal system, each is a case-by-case basis. But one other thing about responsa is, and that's sometimes hard to tell, is that they're often written with pseudonyms and even with, you know, sort of fake names for places, you know, so every responsa, it's like Simon and Reuben, you know, and we don't really know the real names of the people in the case, and it can be construed sometimes that they're just hypothetical situations that the rabbis are debating on a more you know, sort of ideological level. So, you know, we can't take it all out at face value, that's for sure.
So you already actually, in your answer to that question, answered another question from the audience, which was, who were these rabbis, given that there were no rabbis left in Spain at this moment? So I think we have time for two final questions. There's another question about the rabbis issuing these rulings, and then there's a question about the enduring legacy of these rulings. So the question about the rabbis issuing these rulings is, were any of these rabbis themselves conversos? And the question about the kind of enduring legacy is, what kind of afterlife do these halakhic responsa, do these legal responsa have today? Are these still referenced today as descendants of conversos discover their Jewish roots and seek to rejoin the Jewish community?
Okay, great, thank you. Going back to the first question, I'm not aware of any rabbis who themselves were conversos, although I'm certain that many of them had significant parts of their family and communities that were. You know, one thing to keep in mind when you're reading these texts, and also the advice that's given in these responsa texts, is that, you know, the rabbis set the highest standard in terms of, you know, the ideal for religious observance, you know, how people are supposed to conduct themselves according to, you know, an exact interpretation of Jewish law or halakha. And so, you know, they were, in most cases, you know, it was the most religious, the most observant segments of Spanish Jewry that migrated first, that left to escape the Inquisition. It was those who were more assimilated, more integrated into Spanish culture, into, and often, you know, larger landholders, for example, more established as business people rather than as religious leaders, who stayed in Iberia. And, you know, I mean, that's really logical in many ways in terms of, you know, those whose lives and livelihoods revolve around the practice of Judaism versus those who, you know, have much more sort of secular occupations. So I don't know if rabbis who would have, who went through conversion, although there could be examples that I'm not aware of. In terms of, can you remind me what the second question was?
What kind of afterlife do these responsa have? Do we find, for example, individuals who see themselves as coming from converso backgrounds and are trying to reconnect with the Jewish community, rediscover their Jewish roots? Do we see individuals today turning to, citing, wrestling with these responsa?
Sure. Yeah. So responsa, I mean, when we look at the coinciding of, you know, the Spanish expulsion, the proliferation of these sorts of texts nicely coincided with the printing press and the establishment of printing, Hebrew printing within the Jewish world. So some of the most important collections of responsa have been published for many, many centuries, and, you know, are still sometimes available even like on eBay for, you know, with these 400- and 500-year-old collections. They were often also handwritten and transmitted as part of rabbinical learning that rabbinic students would copy and thereby sort of learn by rote the decisions, the narratives, the dialogues, debates happening within these religious communities. And so they were reproduced, and there's some significant variations in different editions of different collections of responsa also. In terms of access today, if you don't have, you know, any of these collections, and I certainly wouldn't be able to do my research without the Bar Ilan University Responsa project, which has been going, I think, since the early 1990s, maybe even longer than that, where Bar Ilan University has been digitizing and making a very accessible responsa database, where you can read responsa from the different rabbis, where you can do keyword searches, where you can find sources in different on different topics. And that database is really invaluable, or is to me. I don't think it's one of the most popular websites in the world, but I find it to be really valuable in terms of accessing the texts.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, this note of accessing the text, because part of what you've done tonight, and that I think we're all so grateful to you for doing, is giving us access to these texts and these voices that have too long gone unheard and unanalyzed in Jewish studies and in Jewish life more broadly. So thank you, Professor Wartell, for that presentation. A few closing words before we bring the evening to a close. First, I do want to offer, in addition to the words of thanks to Professor Wartell for this really engaging and illuminating presentation, I want to offer a few additional words of thanks to the other peoples and communities who made this event possible. So I want to thank the Office of Outreach and Engagement at CU Boulder, again, for its support of the Peak to Peak series, especially Lisa Hope Schwartz in that office. I again want to thank all of our community partners, the Corazon de Trinidad Creative District, the Garfield Public Library District, the Trinidad Carnegie Public Library, Western Colorado University, the Aspen Jewish Congregation, the Boulder JCC, Kavod on the Road, and Temple Aaron in Trinidad. And finally, of course, I want to thank some of the people who made this program possible, my colleagues Linda Park and Liza Williams in the program in Jewish Studies, and of course, our amazing tech, Dan Shastad, who you haven't seen tonight, and that's just a testament to just how amazing he is, that he's working his magic entirely behind the scenes. So those are some thanks. Second quick word before we end is that this is our final event of the 2020-2021 academic year, but kind of shockingly, 2021-2022 is almost upon us. We're going to have a lineup of peak-to-peak virtual concerts in the fall, kind of spanning Jewish music from Europe to the Middle East. These will be followed by a number of programs with faculty from CU and other institutions. That lineup will come out over the summer, so stay tuned for that. We're also excited to be returning to some of our in-person peak-to-peak programs next spring and summer, kind of in ancient times, kind of before the pandemic. Some of you will remember that this series actually involved not just sitting in front of a computer screen, but actually having CU faculty travel to communities across Colorado for in-person programs at no cost to those communities. We're planning to start that up again this spring and next summer. So if you are interested in hosting such a community, such a program in your community in Colorado, please reach out to me. My contact information is on the screen. You can also find it on the Program in Jewish Studies website. We'd love to think about ways in which we can foster this kind of learning, both to a broad audience and in particular communities. And finally, I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight. We throw around the word community a lot in academic settings, but as some of you have heard me say before, that's really what we strive to be in Jewish studies at CU, a community of diverse individuals who are coming together to learn with one another, to think with one another, and to grow with one another. I know that you have many Zoom options. Now, for the first time in a long time, many of us have non-Zoom options as well, and we're really honored that you took the time to create community with us tonight. With that, the chat is again open to anyone who would like to share any final thoughts or say goodbye to the group. Again, just make sure to address your comment to attendees and participants. And again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you in person or remotely at future opportunities for learning.